Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing for the singing of our national anthem.
Let's get Brexit done.
My administration has accomplished more than almost any administration in the history of our country.
Hello and welcome to Atlantic, the show where we look at the news and the views from one side of the Atlantic from the perspective of the other. I'm Royfield Brown, who's back in my beloved Bay Area. Today we're joined by Clint Lose, ex-Capitol Hill staffer in Washington, Latosha Brown, one of the co-founders of Black Voters Matter, political commentator and TV pundit Laura Babcock in Hamilton, Ontario, Kondik, the managing director of Sabato's Crystal Ball, Derek Perkinson of the National Action Network, Karin Robinson of Democratically 2020, the podcast, and Mick Wright, journalistic firestarter in Norwich, and by acclaimed author Jarett Kobek in LA, in a week that has seen the first storming of the Capitol since the British took it in 1812. We try and take stock of what happened this week. Latosha, you are one of the co-founders of Black Voters Matter. Very obviously, this week we had somewhat of a political earthquake before the political earthquake, which was the storming of the Capitol. First off, could you tell us exactly what Black Voters Matters? I think it does what it says on the tin, but tell us exactly about the organisation and how exactly you got the vote out in Georgia to create the first of the 2 weeks political earthquakes.
So Black Voters Matter is a power building organization. It was founded 4 years ago, almost 4 years ago, by myself and Cliff Albright. We wanted to create an organization that could actually help build the capacity of grassroots groups and to build out the ecosystem so organizations and groups that are working to build power for their communities, that they could actually do that without being reliant upon having the best candidate or a political campaign, but that in fact that their campaign would be centered around the power building of their community. And so in that, we created the organization to be a vehicle to help create investment and expand investment in grassroots groups on the ground, to provide them with tools and trainings, and so that we would actually build a coordinated campaign of grassroots organizations. And so in the last 4 years, we've been working throughout the South. Our base is the South. We're based here in Atlanta, Georgia. In the general election, we worked in 15 states throughout the country, including Michigan and Pennsylvania and Ohio, and the other states were primarily in the South. But then, of course, Georgia, it came all back to our home state of Georgia. And so while we've continued and been doing work in Georgia because that's our base, in the runoff election, we directed all of our resources in our state. And so the way that we do our work is that we actually support grassroots organizations on the ground and operate and function almost as a coordinated campaign. And then we layer that with our own operation as well to augment that work that's happening in rural areas. There's three kind of things that we do that I think kind of distinguishes the work. The first thing that we do is we focus on having a rural strategy. So normally what winds up happening politically, you're focusing on these metro centers, and that's what has happened oftentimes in Georgia. And so you focus on metro Atlanta because the numbers in metro can actually change the state one way or the other. But what we knew is that there were pockets of Black voters that lived throughout the state, and that if we were able to mobilize and engage them, that they could offset, even though many of the counties that they lived in, many of their local areas were primarily Republican, that we could actually offset the numbers by having a high turnout in rural areas. And
okay.
So that's
Tosha, let me just hold you there. Kyle, could you just quickly jump in and give us a little bit of an overview of the electorate in Georgia and why specifically it was so important for Black Votes Matters and for the Democratic Party to mobilize African American voters?
Yeah, so when Joe Biden won the state, you could see the sort of alliance of voters in the state, in that Biden did well in Atlanta and also in some of the suburban areas around Atlanta that used to be really Republican, but for a number of reasons have become more Democratic leaning over time. But there also are a fair number of rural Black voters across the state and also across the South, and so mobilizing them is important too. And what you saw in this election, which had really really high turnout. It looks like when it's all said and done, the turnout for these Senate runoffs is going to be about 90% of the total presidential turnout, which is really, really good for a non-presidential election. And I think it was befitting the very high stakes of this runoff, in which control of the U.S. Senate was at stake. But what you saw in the actual granular results, and I think it speaks well to the organizing activities that many on the support Democrats undertook in Georgia, was that some of the highest turnout places, some of the places that had the higher percentage of the turnout compared to the presidential, were in some rural Black areas, particularly in Southwest Georgia, whereas some of the places where turnout was relatively not quite as good were in kind of white rural working class areas, particularly in northern Georgia. And that sort of differential in turnout is a big part of the reason why Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff won these Senate runoffs.
Thank you for that, Carl. Back to you, Latosha. Could you speak to the efforts that specifically your organisation had to make to overcome voter suppression? We heard a lot about that a couple of years ago when Stacey Abrams narrowly lost her gubernatorial race. So give us a sense of the voter suppression laws, rules, which were in place, and how you actually managed to overcome them.
So, there is this, because there was a Black overperformance, there's this kind of narrative that there wasn't voter suppression, that it was equal and fair and free access to the ballot. That was not the case in Georgia. This has been a hellish year in the state of Georgia, in terms of starting from the primary, where I stood personally in line for over 3 hours, and actually went and assisted others that stood in line for over 8 hours at one of the polling sites, the African-American polling sites, in Union City, Georgia. People stood in line. The last voter left the line at 12:37 a.m. Wednesday. And so that is just how atrocious it was in the primary election. If we even go back, I can go back a little bit further than that, which is also, I think, a great example of how egregious voter suppression is in the state of Georgia, that we're currently engaged in a lawsuit where we're suing the Secretary of State, Raffensperger, because in October 2019, he dropped 328,000 people from the voting rolls. Now, some of those people actually had died or through attrition or had moved. But what we discovered, we worked with an investigative journalist, Greg Pallas, and a team of experts who do data hygiene work for data lists for major Fortune 100 companies like Apple and Amazon and Microsoft, that we discovered that there was 198,000 people who had dropped under the guise of that they had moved, yet there was no evidence. We could find no evidence that that was the case. And matter of fact, when our data hygiene experts checked the list, they discovered that none of those people, there was no evidence. They looked at their addresses and put them against 200 different sources. And there was no evidence that they should have been dropped from the voting rolls. And so we reached out there was a report that came out in September. We reached out to the Secretary of State's office and said, and even offered, let your experts sit with our experts and let's figure out, how could you be 198,000 votes off, to figure out what went wrong. He refused to take us up on that offer, and actually, defended the fact that they had taken the 198,000 people, dropped them from the voting rolls, right? And these are people just recently, we actually picked up the list and started calling some of those voters. We reached out to 100,000, but we called some of those voters. Just the first week, there were 12 voters that we called. The first person that we called had been living in their home for 27 years. They've never moved. He said, I've never even thought about moving. I don't know how I'm on the list. The second person we called had been in their home for 18 years. So the bottom line is, voter suppression is alive in the state of Georgia. It's not well. Grassroots organizers who have worked in an environment where we've had a very, very racially intense environment that we worked in, where voter suppression is the norm, unfortunately is not the exception, that we have found very sophisticated ways to really be able to navigate through it by the way we organize our community. Even when we're thinking about data and we're thinking about turnout, we know that oftentimes we have to overperform to make sure that we offset the voter suppression. And so what you saw in the state of Georgia is you saw an overperformance of Black voters. The actual establishment of the runoff system itself was created, quote, to break up the Negro voting bloc. And so this was extraordinary what Black voters did in the state of Georgia, that they came out in record numbers.
Fantastic. Kyle, back to you. Would you have any sense of the level of black underperformance because of voter suppression in states where that is somewhat prevalent? How much difference would that maybe make to some of the deepest of red states?
I don't have a great sense of that, and but I will say, just generally speaking, that black voter turnout just in a number of states across the country where the black vote is significant, and really black voters are significant in almost all of the key states in the electoral college, including a number of the states in the industrial north, like Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin, that are whiter than the national average, but do have really important pockets of black voters. But I think in some ways, Barack Obama being on the ballot in 2008 and 2012 did help, I think, increase black turnout in a lot of places. And then black turnout kind of lagged a little bit relative to 2008 and 2012 in 2016 and 2020. But I think that thinking about that, I think helps make what happened in Georgia on Tuesday so impressive, is that the Republicans did make up a little bit of ground compared to how Biden performed in amongst what appears to be kind of affluent white suburbanites. But the extra black turnout, in the kind of greater share of turnout that black voters made up of the electorate on Tuesday compared to back in November, that helped deliver these races for Democrats. And beyond organizing efforts, I think it's useful to think about that the Democrats did have, I think, a pretty compelling black candidate on the ballot in Reverend Raphael Warnock. And there is some political science research. Again, maybe it seems obvious, but these things aren't always don't always bear out the way that you might think that they would. But there is some evidence that having a strong black candidate at the top of the ticket, be it Obama or be it someone like Warnock, can have a positive impact on black turnout, as I think it probably did in these runoffs.
Thank you for that, Carl. Latosha, how significant was it that Warnock is going to be the first black senator elected in Georgia? What does it mean to Georgians? What does it mean actually specifically to Black Votes Matters for your sterling efforts? We've been told that it's historic, it's unprecedented, but what does it actually mean to those activists on the ground?
So let me just give a little background. I think it's really interesting. In the state of Georgia, this is a state that has never sent an African American to the Senate. This is a state that has one of the states that has been a stalwart as it relates to being a Confederate state, that it has proudly worn the Confederate flag until recent years, that it has been really a central power space for the Southern strategy and white Southern power. And so in a state such as this, in a state where you have a minister, a black preacher, who is the minister of the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church, which is the church that's the home church of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his family, who grew up as one of 12 children from a working class family, actually toppled the wealthiest congressperson in DC. That in itself is pretty profound, just in terms of the whole argument around electability. The second thing, though, I think is really important and critical, is that he is also someone that actually comes out of the faith tradition. What we have seen in recent years is that what I call Confederate Christianity, there has been a Christianity in the U.S. in many ways is conservative Christianity, which I actually say it actually should be called Confederate Christianity. It's literally hijacked the whole faith tradition in politics. That when we're talking about faith in politics, it has been dominated by this white, very right-wing kind of Christian group. And so here it is that there's an African-American preacher that comes out of the faith tradition, which is actually rooted in social justice in the African-American community. So for him to win is also another win for those a part of the tradition in the South that has actually come up fighting against these structures, these racist structures. And then so overall, what I think is a state like Georgia, when we're looking at Currently, right now, 4 million people have applied for unemployment. We're looking at a state like Georgia that the African-American population at the height of COVID-19 in April, 80% of all hospitalizations that were COVID-related in the state were African-Americans, although we make only 30% of the population. That when you're looking at some of the critical issues that our community has faced and is dealing with, and you're looking at for the lack of leadership that we've seen from our state leadership, from the governor's office and from the president, particularly as it relates to COVID-19, having Raphael Warnock in that position that actually has an experience from our community. He comes from our community. He comes from the rich, prophetic, Black theological liberation tradition. I think that means a lot for us to also have to be able to send the youngest senator, who will be Senator Ossoff, Senator-elect Ossoff, who also happens to be a Jewish man from the South. That in itself also blows up this whole argument around electability in the Deep South.
Very obviously, we had unprecedented scenes in the Capitol on Wednesday. Clint Lose, you're an ex-Capitol Hill staffer, so I'm going to come to you first. How predictable, after the rhetoric which we've seen from Trump in the last 4 years, how predictable was that his presidency was going to end with something like this?
Utterly predictable. Anyone who's shocked by this hasn't been paying attention. It was still surprising to see, though. It's just such a break from norms and the usual restraint and the kind of the decency of American politics, as ugly as it has been. It just crossed a line that hasn't really been crossed, I think, in modern memory, at least for a lot of us who've been in DC for a number of years. So. But it is entirely the result of Trump being enabled by the Republicans to whip up folks like this.
Okay, thanks for that, Clint. Mick, you're over there in Norwich in the UK, so you're one of our seasoned watchers of American politics from beyond American shores. How exactly did this all play out in the British media? How was Britain, how was the world, your proxy for the world now here, looking at these events of America, and what do you think it said about America?
Well, I think it was interesting how it played out in the British press, because the British press is over-represented on the right wing, and a lot of people on the right wing in the British press had been pretty pro-Trump and had written quite a lot of pro-Trump things, and are now reversing at high speed and changing their view or trying to pretend things they wrote didn't exist. Obviously, people were shocked by it. I think also it was interesting to see that because we have a press like much of the US press, which is always willing and always tries to underplay white supremacy, fascism, hard right politics in general. There was a lot of avoidance of words like rioters and terror and domestic terror and all these kind of things, which had these had the people who stormed the Capitol been of a different religious or ethnic background, certainly it would have been framed in a different way. So while there was shock and while it was presented as like this is incredible, this is insane, it was also, I felt, clearly doing a lot of water carrying for white supremacy, but then that's a problem our press has here.
I couldn't help but notice, Latosha, looking at the way of which the Capitol Police, at least some of the Capitol Police, enabled that demonstration and allowed the protesters to get all the way to the doors of the Capitol building, that, as Mick said, if this had been a Black Lives Matters protest, it would have been somewhat different. Was one of the stunning aspects of the what we saw on Wednesday an expression of white American privilege when it comes to confronting and protesting, in air quotes, against the American state?
So I think there's three quick points. The first point is a Black Lives Matter protesters never would have been able to get to that point, right? They never would have been able to even get on the grounds. I've been on the grounds myself and been still checking my cell phone and been approached by security saying, "Ma'am, you need to move along." So the mere fact that they were actually able to get on actually speaks to something different as well, because I actually don't think that it was just anybody who's been in DC knows that is the most secured ground in this country. So for them to get an advance where they got, that was not just an outside outside we didn't have enough people. That was something that there was some complicitness around law enforcement within that. And I think that will come out in the watch. The second thing is I think that it also speaks to a larger issue, which spurred the Black Lives Matter movement earlier this year and around the movement around the message around defund the police. Because what it seems very apparent is that police in this country, which was formed, quite frankly, was formed out of slave patrols. That's how the very founding of the police was created, that it has one purpose, and that is to the management and control of people of color and poor people, because it can't be about keeping peace and order. That is not what we saw. If you actually look at some of the video, you can actually see the police literally holding the hand of a protester not a protester, of a seditionist, walking down the stairs. There were officers within the Capitol that as the place was being torn up, they were taking selfies. So we know that there is something much deeper at this, and I think it will come out in the wash. And the third and the final thing is that it is apparent. Like, we can stop with this idea of, whether it be different. We all know it would be different, right? We all know, I think it points to something greater around how we value human life and what human life is valued. But also when we're looking at who is violent and who has been violent to who in this country and who really is standing on Tuesday, I think you saw a demonstration of Black citizens, white citizens, Latino citizens, a rainbow coalition of people in this country that, and led by, quite frankly, a lot of that energy led by black voters that literally said that we believe in democracy and peace, right? Yet you saw the next day, and I think that grows out of white privilege, is this idea of that we can actually control and destroy. And then part of that is the fear of that. And I think that what some people are seeing now, some of the Republicans are starting to understand, is that evil and hatred cannot be contained. And so now that once you're thinking that as long as that's directed at Black people, it is okay. And that fire continues to grow and grow. And all of a sudden, what it will do, it will actually consume this country if it is not put out and extinguished.
Amen to that, sister. Very, very powerfully said. Doug Levy, you're over there in San Francisco, or just north of San Francisco. I didn't realize that the Capitol Hill police had actually been defunded because they didn't exactly pull out their weapons against these protesters. So who knew? Who knew that under a Trump administration that defund the police was going to have such profound effects?
It is really stunning. As I think you know, I've worked with law enforcement in my emergency management role over the years, and I truly can't explain. There is. Incompetence doesn't explain what happened. The failure of planning, or the absence of planning, or the planning, whatever it was completely wrong. And I think we all can suspect why. There has to be more to it than we currently know. I think we will find out.
Doug, I'm going to quickly jump in. Jarett, you're a deep thinker. You look at the
supposedly.
You like to analyze the dark underbelly of America and its psyche, but also of humanity. What does this tell us on a deeply philosophical level about the Trump years? We've had Trump ripping up norms, but actually he's done it quite literally in the end. Give us your take.
I always feel like one of those mid-century liberals who sees something happen and can only see the various processes that lead into it. I mean, I think the answer is what the answer has always been. The Trump era is a manifestation of a series of very long-running processes in this society that have come to a horrible fruition. That's what it looked like to me. I mean, it looked like everything else. It looked like the obvious things to me. But if you look at the people who are showing up, those people are the product of a lot of really unchecked things that have been allowed to fester in American life. And some of those things have had tacit approval from a lot of different sectors. this is what happens when you convert the entire society over.
Derek, you obviously work for the Action National Network. You guys are kind of preeminent when it comes to organize. What conversations you would have had with law enforcement beforehand? Give us that kind of sense.
I'm glad you brought that up, Rofield. Hello, everyone. It's good to be here. My overseas friends and Latosha Brown, you my hero. I salute you, sister, and your team over there in Georgia. And all the work you've done. So I'm glad you asked that, Rofield, only because that Reverend Sharpton, I'm Derek Perkinson with the National Action Network organization, started 30 years this year by Reverend Dr. Al Sharpton. He spoke about, right in August, we did 250,000 person march on Washington in commemoration of the Dr. King March in '63. We had to go through hoops to get the Capitol Police and the parks over there to get these permits and credentials to get on there. That's why we know something more deeper and sinister is at play here, because you cannot go there and protest. You cannot gather in that space unless you have the proper credentials. People, you cannot carry a pole. You can't have a sign with a stick up unless you have proper certification, and they won't even let you have a sign with a stick. So we know things are at play. We had to go through the ringer to get our permits and different certifications for the march in August 28th. And we don't know. We're just looking at this like everybody else, but we know there's some sinister play, some sinister things at hand here. I mean, again, we stay saying systemic, right? Systemic. People get mad when we say that. But when you see the Capitol Police moving the barricades over to let people in, when you see them taking selfies with trespassers, people who's breaking the law, you have to ask yourself, there's something more deeper that's going on here. So, I'm not really a proponent of defund police, blow up the system and all of these other things that's going on, but it needs to be a deep cleansing in our law enforcement agencies nationwide, starting from the local level right on up. It has to be a deep cleansing because it's that.
Thank you for that, Derek. Karin, I'm going to come over to you. Has this been the last impotent spasm of Trumpism? Can we now wash our hands of it, all of us, in the decent kind of end of politics, and say amen to that? Can we turn over a new leaf? It's a Biden administration. No more Trump and his base.
Well, no. I mean, quite obviously, no. So I can expand on that. And I would really like to, because one of the things I'm very keen that we do in this conversation is to put squarely in the president's lap the responsibility that he personally bears. We have systemic problems. We have potentially complicity by law enforcement. We have lots of problems with the behavior of everybody from legislators down to individual citizens on the street. But I was going through the timeline of Wednesday's events for my podcast this week, and the president himself stood up at a rally in front of 30,000 of his most fervent supporters on Wednesday morning, 10 to noon. He started to speak. He was speaking until just before 1 o'clock. Spoke a little over an hour. He spoke. He concluded his remarks by saying, "Now let's walk up to Pennsylvania Avenue to where the Capitol building is, and let's have a show of strength." His supporters complied with his request, and by 2:20 in the afternoon, they had penetrated the congressional building and were basically terrorizing the nation. He directed his supporters to commit an act of sedition and domestic terrorism against the lawmakers of his own government. He did this because, frankly, I don't think that he has a specific plan to take over the U.S. government. I think it's worse than that. He's weak and flailing and pitiful, and yet still extremely successful, because he has successfully taken over one of the two political parties in the United States of America. And he will continue to exert enormous power in the Republican Party, but not because of the behavior of legislators, but because of the behavior of voters, who he has successfully over the last few years weaned them off of all other sources of knowledge.
Karin, you say it's not just because of legislators, it's because of the voters. But so many of the legislators have been complicit. We had Ted Cruz, somebody who Donald Trump tore a strip off when he was running to be a Republican candidate. Impugned his wife. We have Josh Hawley, giving the fists up. These guys are all complicit as well, aren't they?
So of course they're complicit, but I guess my point that I would make is they're cowards and traitors. However, they are also rational beings responding to the incentives ahead of them. You can be both, right? It is completely logical for them to behave in the way that they are, and the way that they're behaving is also shameful.
Okay, great. Laura, we haven't heard from you. One of the, I think, poetic things about what Trump did on Wednesday was to say, I will be with you when you walk down to the Capitol building. Then he got into his armor-plated car and drove off in the opposite direction. Isn't this just like writ in neon sign, the vacuity of Trumpism and how disingenuous Trump has actually been to his supporters?
I see it very differently. I don't think he's weak at all. I think the evidence he's incredibly powerful. It wasn't since the British and the Canadians, in 1812 were down there that this has happened. He's very powerful, and he runs essentially his own terrorist group, his own militia, his own army, whatever you want to call that. Whatever we saw, it was alien to anything that we have seen in hundreds of years. In fact, it reminded me of that scene in World War Z when they crawl up the wall, all the aliens on top of each other. It was beyond. And here in Canada, we watched it. And there was that moment around 4:30 Eastern Standard Time where I felt like we were waiting, when the planes were, after they hit the World Trade Center and then towers, and then we were waiting and they hit the Pentagon, that moment when we didn't know if America would survive. We thought it was going to collapse. It was incredibly jarring. And Canadians were very involved in 9/11 in the days following, in terms of taking flights in and everything else. So for Canadians, it was very, very traumatic to watch. And I think he's very powerful. And I didn't see that as him being cowardly. I saw that as coded messaging. When he said, walk down there and I'll be with you, maybe, just maybe, that was him indicating that, don't worry, I got people there who are going to help you with this, right? Which is what we've all been talking about, the complicity and the fact that how do you open gates and open doors? How do you let people in and take selfies with them unless there's some sort of complicity there? So I think that was code. And if you look at the through thread, language is my business. If you look at the through narrative of every statement he has made at that speech and on Twitter, and then subsequently the video, everything has had the singular narrative of endurance. All of them have ended, no matter what he said, they've all ended with, I'll be with you, we continue, we are strong, we'll keep going. Even the one that people were championing last night as being some kind of concession speech, he talked about how they would continue to be powerful. So let's just get rid of this notion that Trump is some sort of weak loser. Trump is winning, and that was a win for him January 6th. And we've got to do everything we can to stop it, and stop it in Canada, because we've got the same issue here.
All right, Laura.
Rolfield, I got a fun fact everybody might not know. And
quickly, Derek.
Really quick. 1954, a Puerto Rican hero named Lolita LeBron stormed the U.S. House of Representatives. They gave her 49 years. She served 25 years. So that's precedent for these people that stormed that. And they're trying to call them mob. They were domestic terrorists. There were explosive devices found there. 5 people died. So let's not lose sight of those things. Thank you for that.
Thank you for giving us that little bit of a history lesson. Clint, I'm going to come back over onto you. We've had 2 members of Trump's cabinet resign. We've had other lesser luminaries of the administration walk away. How significant should we take these resignations? Unmute yourself, Clint.
I thought the anthem of 2020 had died, but it has not. They are significant in the way that rats fleeing a sinking ship are significant. These are folks who are going to try to get jobs in a post-Trump world, and they are going to have to find a way to make themselves palatable in the event that like we do claw ourselves back to some sense of normalcy and decency, we can't get all the way back, but when we get back to something a little bit more normal, these are people who are going to want to be on boards, so going to want to be in positions of power, and so they are finally throwing in the towel because this is a bridge too far. Not morally, I don't suspect, but in terms of their future prospects as employees.
Brilliant. Thank you. Kyle, obviously we saw several thousand Trump supporters outside that Capitol building. Then they stormed it. A woman was shot dead by Capitol Police, etc. How significant of the Republican Party, let's say the Republican coalition, do you think this Trump base is?
Well, look, I mean, I think a lot of people who voted for the president are basically just rank and file Republicans who, would vote for basically any Republican over any Democrat. And look, I think there are a lot of Democratic voters who are the same way. We're in a period of very high party loyalty in the United States, very similar actually to the late 1800s. It was also a time where there wasn't much ticket splitting. There was a lot of party loyalty. But at the same time, I think you also saw that there are a lot of people who see Trump as sort of this, it's almost like a cult figure, and there is cult followers, and that there, I think through a lot of kind of internet conspiracy theories, QAnon is I think maybe the most prominent one, that there's something more than that, and they were expressing themselves, and some of these people I think are attempting to do violence. I mean, for as bad as what happened was, and it was horrible. I think it may have been the worst thing I'd ever seen since 9/11 in terms of basically a national scar. It could have been a lot worse because you had these people who were armed, who supposedly were looking for Vice President Pence, who were looking for the Speaker of the House, and you just wonder if something like this will happen again, and if it'll be even worse next time. And the president was definitely egging those folks on.
Jarett, over to you. Kyle mentioned Mike Pence. The president put a target on his back, definitely in the minds, at least, of his acolytes, of his followers, definitely with the speech that he gave before they went and stormed the Capitol. And Mike Pence, by all accounts, was the member of the government who actually called out the National Guard. And Mike Pence did tell Trump, no, I'm going to do my ceremonial duty. I'm not going to stop due process. Is Mike Pence now the acting president of the United States, at least for the next, 12 days?
Who can say? I mean, no one knows, right? That's part of this moment, which is it's all chaos. We have to live in this chaos. I don't know. Pence is one of those people where you can see what the wages of sin actually are. All the ambition, all the greed that made him accept that role, which he didn't have to accept as Trump's vice president. Now it has come to weigh upon him. That's the moment he's in. And I think what we're seeing is him trying to salvage whatever it means to be Mike Pence. But he's a chief enabler of all of it.
Mick, there's been some talk that the 25th Amendment should be invoked. Obviously, if that is going to be invoked, Mike Pence would be central to that. Should we just ride out the next, week plus with this crazy man in the White House, or should the American government, should the American system eject him for the remaining days of his presidency?
Well, I'm not a constitutional expert, but the way I see it is I think that the 25th is not going to happen for a number of reasons, including I think there is no way that Pence wants to be president for a number of days. Like, he does still have in his mind some sense that he might run in 2024. So it would be really damaging to him to be this Potemkin president for a number of days. The other thing I'd say is, like, okay, Nancy Pelosi is saying she's gonna is pushing forward with moving towards some kind of impeachment process. Like, I don't know if they can turn that around quick enough. It is really grandstanding when she says stuff like, "I've spoken to the military about preventing Trump from having access to the to the nuclear codes or for orders to be followed down," because currently the law in the law, Trump has control of these things, and there's the mechanisms are there, but these mechanisms don't work quick enough. The other thing I just wanted to say was in 1923, the beer hall putsch in Munich, when Hitler's followers did the beer hall putsch, the international coverage of it and the coverage in Germany was, look at this clown, look at these guys, this was clownish, this coup didn't happen, this coup didn't work. There's a very sort of milquetoast centrist publication called Tortoise over here in the UK, and they wrote, oh well, look, it's not a coup because they didn't do this, that and the other, the things that you need to do a coup. Just because they fucked it up doesn't mean that it was an attempt, a very serious attempt to do something. And 10 years after the beer hall putsch, Hitler took power in Germany. Now, will that be Trump retaking power? Probably not. But the right wing, the white supremacist fascist ideology that is at the heart of what's happening now, it will stay and thrive. And the notion that the grown-ups are back in the room and Biden can fix it all is for the birds.
All right. Let's go with that thought. Tucker Carlson, one of Trump's key proponents for the last 4 years, said this: he's reached his shelf life, and he being Tucker Carlson, had blamed him for inciting the riot at the US Capitol, the sedition, let's call it that. But he said the word riot, and that Trump has recklessly encouraged his supporters, and he's reached his expiration date. Laura, doesn't that mean that the right wing are turning away from Trump and Trumpism? We can all breathe a sigh of relief. Tucker Carlson said so.
No, it means Tucker is lining himself up to be the head of the ticket in 2024, and he's trying to bring everyone over. I mean, they will sacrifice Trump to keep his army and to get back into power. So no, I don't take that at face value at all. And moreover, if you even look at some of the narratives that Fox has been pushing out, they've been pushing out the idea that, the really bad ones, the ones who really upset everybody, were Antifa, snuck in there into this whole thing. And of course, it's laughable to all of us, but I caution again, this felt like a 9/11 event from people outside of America, at least from the Canadian view. And if there is not a 9/11 level response, the whole smoke them out of the caves equivalent or whatever that's going to be. I just heard Biden speak, and Biden was all, they're domestic terrorists and they'll be prosecuted or persecuted, whatever. But we need to have a moment for the world that says, no, America's got this. They're going to reestablish their authority over this problem. And if that doesn't happen soon, yeah, of course, no 25th Amendment's going to happen. Impeachment will be a show, and it may or may not result in anything. But there has to be a really big response, because this narrative of it wasn't as bad as it looked and the bad guys weren't us, and it is being seen as a win in the Republican circles, and it's being seen as a win in the right-wing circles, and it is getting recruitment going. There were celebrations in Canada from right-wing groups on this. We can't pretend this was a failure. It wasn't to their cause. They were seen celebrating. There's video of Trump's family celebrating this. So there'll be some fallout on Trump, but don't think for a second that it has done anything to really damage those extreme Tucker Carlson ends of the Republican Party. This is the kind of fuel they want for 2024.
Doug Levy. So basically, Josh Hawley, this is the start of his campaign for 2024. Ted Cruz and him are going to duke it out, are they, over the dead, rotting corpse of the old Republican Party?
I hope that's not the case. I do think that Hawley in particular has been targeted for shame because of the way he conducted himself after the riot, and deserves it. And his whiny post complaining that his book contract got canceled. My God, that was just despicable. And I also think that people understand that he is a Ivy League trained lawyer, as is Ted Cruz. And what he was claiming from a standpoint of the law was BS. So I think he was just grandstanding, and I don't think it's going to work because he actually isn't as slick as he thinks he is. Tucker Carlson, though, I think we do need to worry about, because Tucker Carlson, while decrying the riot, was also defending the people who rioted indirectly. What we saw was thousands of white Republican Trump supporters taking what they believed they were entitled to, just as Trump grabs them by the whatever because he thinks he's entitled to it. And you have Tucker Carlson getting on TV defending that. These people are angry because
I think you're completely right. Should we then venerate exactly what the senator from Utah said, which is that we need to tell people the truth?
That would be a really good starting point. But how do we do that when we have 74 million Americans who are immune to the truth? And in fact, the polling data that I've seen since Wednesday shows that a majority of Republicans still think the election was stolen and that they have a right to be upset. What Trump has succeeded in doing is destabilizing the American government.
All right, Doug, thank you for that contribution. Derek, from January the 20th, there is going to be a new president. Whether we have an interim president before, only time will tell. How should we deal with President Trump, with ex-President Trump?
That's a good question. That's going to be tough. He has a lot of options at his hand. Before he ran for president, he was doing stints on The Apprentice for 10, 15 years. So he's going to have a lot of opportunities to do things. But you guys forget this. He's going to be dogged by multiple lawsuits when he leaves office. He'll be fighting these lawsuits to the day he dies. And that's just a fact of life. So when you say how to deal with him, society will deal with him. New York, I know the Northern District, New York, Southern District has some lawsuits coming. I know some other places that have lawsuits. He will be dogged for his remainder time out of office. He's going to fight him till he passes. That's usually how these things work. But how do we deal with the 72 million people that support him? How do we deal with the Trump fanatics who believe the lies, who believe the election was stolen? That's something we all going to have to figure out. But we're going to have to pass real laws, real policy that's going to incriminate people for minor acts of racism, discrimination, and stuff like that. So we have to really continue the election, elect people in office that's going to do right by us. We can't get sidetracked by the Trump supporters. That's because they, like Trump said, if he's on Fifth Avenue, if he shoots someone, he's get away with it. His people will still love him. They're still going to love him.
All right, Kyle, is that still true? Surely this storming of the Capitol was the equivalent of Trump trying to deliver on his boast that he can shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue. He tried to shoot the American Republic. He didn't succeed. So surely Trump isn't quite as omnipotent as we all said. How do we tell truth to those Trump supporters that actually not only is he a sham and a fraud, but key specifically in this instance that the election was not stolen? How do we do that?
Well, it does seem like some Republican elites, at least, are kind of distancing themselves here at the end. Now, of course, I guess it's easier to do so given that he lost the election, that the Electoral College, results are now certified. Joe Biden's going to take over on January 20th. But, the key question is does Trump run again in the future? And what sort of support does he get from the rank and file if he does? I mean, I'm assuming if you take a poll today and ask Republican voters, hey, who do you support for the next Republican nomination in 2024? Trump would probably lead the list. Now, some of that is just, name identification and whatnot and goodwill, at least toward Republican voters. But if you were to run, could he be defeated in a primary? Could the Republican elites bring the voters along? Part of the whole reason that Trump got nominated was that Republican base voters had come to really hate their own elites in their party. And so they in some ways, if Trump was opposed by leadership, that might actually make him an even more potent force in the Republican Party. Whether there's lingering damage from this, I don't know. I mean, there's been so many outrageous things that have happened since Trump came down, the escalator in Trump Tower in 2015, and yet his support amongst Republicans has really been very strong throughout much of that period. So there may not be an answer here, and it may be that Trump is going to continue to be with us and continue to be kind of the de facto head of the Republican Party.
Clint, many people are speculating that basically we are going to see the end of this version of the Republican Party. Where do you stand with that analysis? Can we see the right politically in America splitting off? We have had hints of this beforehand. We've had the Tea Party, etc., which wasn't a separate party, but a faction of which the Trump base seems to be fundamentally composed of those Tea Party kind of elements. Where next for the Republican Party, sir?
That's hard to say because I think they're going to have to spend a little bit of time fighting each other for it. And hopefully the centrist Republicans win. They're the least worst, the least bad of the lot, and maybe they can drag the base over the course of the next many years back into some sense of reality. But I do think that you're just going to see a split, not so much for control, but I think you're going to see the rump of the Trump segment of the party just become even more radicalized. I think that's going to be the real problem. Is that a lot of Republicans will kind of put Trump behind them. They'll want to get on with things, but there's just going to be a segment of the party that is going to look back on January 6th as their lost cause, and they're going to celebrate this day every year. And it's going to be one of those things where the FBI every January 6th is going to be on the lookout for domestic right-wing terrorists who are going to try and reclaim this day.
Deary me, Clint, it's almost the end of the show, and I want to bring us up, and you're worrying the hell out of me even more, sir. Jarett, we have the Democratic Party in control of all three branches of government now. Surely this is a kumbaya moment in terms of those on the left saying we can push through some kind of level of radical change, or basically those centrist senators, are they the true power brokers of American politics, at least for the next 2 years, whether it is the Democratic senator from West Virginia through to Susan Collins in Maine, etc. Is this a victory for the left or the center?
I would hope that it's a victory for the left. My assumption is that it's probably going to be a victory from the center. I mean, we've had a 50-50 split in the Senate in relatively recent memory, and that was pretty dysfunctional. But who knows? I'm trying to keep an open mind about all of this. Maybe it does turn out to be, maybe the promises finally get delivered, but we'll see.
Mick, what should be the top of, let's put coronavirus to one side and making sure that those vaccines get out to the states. Let's say that that's gonna happen, right? What should be top of President Biden's in tray? Tell me two things he should attend to first.
Healthcare and poverty. If you want to take things off, if you want to disempower the far right, then you need to make sure that poor people of all colors are better off and feel that the state does things for them, and it doesn't leave a position where right-wing demagogues can make these wild promises because it just seems like no one cares. There's a huge problem, I think, when I look at someone like Nancy Pelosi, who says things about $2,000 stimulus checks and about how it's not really that much money or whatever. It's like there is a disconnection, and there's a disconnection in the Democratic elite, which was a problem. It was a problem under Obama, and it will still be a problem under Biden unless they seriously start to rethink the way they address poverty and the causes of discontent, and healthcare, because America is a sick country. People are not well. If I get sick here, if I get cancer, I probably won't. There's a high chance I won't die because the NHS will give me treatment. And it doesn't ruin my life financially to get sick, but it does in America. That's a bizarre country, and that's one of the biggest issues for me. I could never move to America for that reason.
Karin, how impressed have you been with the utterances from the president-elect this week? To me, at least he sounded somewhat presidential.
Yeah, I think Joe Biden said the right things. I think he meant the right things also. I think, he's somebody who he got into the race in the first place following Charlottesville, having been appalled by President Trump's behavior. And I think what we saw on Wednesday was the culmination of exactly what Joe Biden is here to oppose. I think it's also true that Joe Biden is someone who has a real reverence for the Senate as an institution. And so I think for him, it was unacceptable to see what happened on Wednesday. He still has a really tough job ahead of him. It is fantastic that we have taken back the Senate. That makes it possible for Joe Biden to govern. It wasn't clear until we knew the outcome of Georgia how easy it would be for him to even appoint a cabinet. Whether he would be able to get any legislation even on the Senate floor, let alone passed. So he has the opportunity to govern now, and I think that's fantastic. I think, just the fact that the country has a chance of getting its problems solved. For the past 4 years, whatever problems the country's had, it hasn't been possible to move anything forward, good, bad, or indifferent. So I think, Joe Biden is on the right step to do a lot of the right things. It won't be everything I've dreamed of course, but I think, anything is better than what we've had before, what we've had over the last few years. And I actually genuinely, I have decided to feel good today. I've decided to believe that there is possibility for change in America because, they wouldn't be so angry if they didn't feel threatened on the other side. They see that their power is waning, and Democrats have an opportunity now. We've got a couple of years before the midterm elections to show the American people what we can do, and we actually have the ability to make that change. So I'm excited about that.
Thank you for bringing us up. One last question. I'm going to put this to everybody. So when you want to answer, when you feel you can answer, hold your hand up, and then I'm going to come to you. This inauguration speech by President Biden needs to be the most powerful statement that America has had delivered to it since the end of the Second World War. Since FDR delivered that wonderful speech before just after D-Day, saying that American men were going to liberate Europe. This is how important this moment is. I'm going to ask you one by one, tell me one or two words that President Biden needs to put in his inauguration speech for America to recognize the last 4 years, but to turn the page on that and to look forward. So who wants to go first? Laura Babcock.
He's got to mention healing, because not only does that cover the whole issue around COVID and the immediate concern of everyone, but that is really why he decided to run, was to heal the nation and to get it back to where he thinks it should be. And he has to mention building, which is part of his Build Back Better, this whole idea of the economy, because there is right now, I think, millions out of that 75 million that voted for Trump that right now don't want to become part of that Trump party that they saw the other day. And if he can bring them over with kind of an economic message, one that they think they can relate to and that they can feel can really make them more financially viable, that is going to be a winning message for him. And when you have major unions or major trade organizations like the manufacturers calling for Trump to step down, that means there's an opportunity for Biden to really bring big business in and to really get the sense that he is going to be the president that will rebuild America. The idea of that big build idea, I think, is critical.
Jarett, you're a man who's made his money out of prose, sir. So I reckon if anyone could give good speech, it was you. So imagine you're one of Biden's script writers.
I wouldn't take that job. I don't have an answer to this question.
I'm putting that job on you now. So go.
What crime did I commit to have this job? I couldn't do it.
You were born an American citizen, sir. So you have skin in the game.
I do have skin in the game. I really don't know, because what you're talking about is a message that has to be filtered through a persona. And can that persona really speak to the moment? I don't have a lot of faith in that. So I gotta say,
this is not the way I want to end this podcast. So. Doug Levy, you held your hand up. Go.
He has to keep doing what he's been doing, which is stay very close to the center, talk about healing, as Laura mentioned. But he also has to really make it clear that he hears you. He's listening. Great. He understands why people are angry.
Fantastic. Karin.
So I think Joe Biden's best moments of rhetoric are when he speaks from the heart, and his personal story of grief and loss has something that has carried him through his entire career. So I think he's in a really good position to bring his personal story, to talk about the grief and trauma that the country is going through, and to Laura's point, certainly talk about healing, but talk about it in a way that's filtered through his own life story and making a connection to the American people. That's kind of what he's been doing on the campaign trail, and it's been really effective. I think he can now build that into kind of a bigger story about kind of where we can go once we've I don't
want to sound too cynical, but being a Brit listening to American politicians give speeches, they always do that, don't they? You know, the little homily about their own kind of personal life. And
but they do it because it works.
Okay. Clint, you held your hand up. You're going to knock the ball out the park before we come on to Kyle.
I think it's not going to be enough for Biden to talk about just healing and overcoming politics. He's going to have to talk about it in a way that's so much bigger than anyone has really talked about coming together nationally ever before. It's not just about overcoming politics. It's about really getting to an entirely new place as a nation that bridges this gap. It's not about papering over the gap between the parties. It is really about moving everybody to kind of a new plane of political existence, as it were. And I think that's kind of going to have to be the note, because it's not going to be sufficient to say, let's hold hands and get together and go back to the old days. He has to chart a path forward to an exciting new place for people to believe in.
Right. Now, I believe we haven't heard from Kyle. I don't think we've heard from Mick. We're going to end up with you, Jarett, because I know you held your hand up. So, Kyle, I know you're a man that fundamentally you look at numbers and statistics, but you're going to have to put the numbers to one side now, right? You're in that president-elect script writing team, and they want a knockout line or so, which is going to help infuse and to transform the nation of your birth. What do you put on that piece of paper, Kyle?
Well, I don't know what I would put on the piece of paper, but I would say that the Democrats sometimes, I think, have trouble basically articulating a case for national greatness, essentially. And I think that I would say I personally, and I feel like a lot of people.
But that Kennedy was all about.
But that was also
the moon because it's there. That's national greatness, surely.
That was decades and decades ago. And whatever you want to say about Trump, he did have this sort of theme of national restoration, I guess.
American carnage, and he delivered on it, didn't he?
Well, I mean, look, I'm not defending the president's rhetoric or anything, but I do think that if Biden is going to have sustaining success for the Democratic Party, he needs for Democrats not to get killed in the 2022 elections, and keeping the energy level of the Democratic base high is something he needs to do.
How do you do that, Kyle? How are you going to do that? Come on, get us pumped, Kyle.
Well, that's what he needs to do. I don't know if he can do it or not, but the Democrats aren't going to have Trump necessarily to keep their party unified and to keep themselves engaged. Although who knows, the president might be hanging around so much that he keeps the Democrats' energy level high.
All right. Well, I tell you who needs to keep their energy levels. 1 second, I've got an important thing to say. I tell you who needs to keep their energy levels high on Sunday. It's the Cleveland Browns, because we have not been in the playoffs since 2002. And Kyle, like me, is a fellow Browns fan. So go Dog Pound. Mick Wright. Exactly. Mick Wright.
Well, firstly, I think that American politics, one of its biggest problems is this obsession with rhetoric and the gulf between rhetoric and reality. Right? This is not the West Wing.
Country built an idea.
Whoa, sunshine. You asked me the question. Let me finish it. Right. So there's too many people who want a President Bartlett, right? And I think actually that there could be something from a speech that says, I understand the realities here. I understand that this is tough. I could promise you a shining city on the hill, but that is not where we are right now. But here are some practical things that I will do in the first 100 days. Don't go high rhetoric. Go really focused and practical and say, in the first 100 days, these are the things that I want to get done. I want to fix health. I want to start fixing healthcare again. I want to address the poverty issues. I want to address the things that are meaning that you can't look after your family in the way you want to. That's what he needs to say. Make a retail politics offer.
It's still the economy, stupid.
Yeah.
You know what's great about this, you Americans, is taking a Brit to tell you what the next American president should say to you all, right?
But he should focus on justice. I didn't mention that. That's how you keep the Democrats.
I 100% agree. Justice. It is about justice.
Justice and economic justice. Because fundamentally, we've dealt with American themes, it's only right and proper, even though a Brit has come out with a great point, we're going to end with an American on this podcast. Jarett, you held your hand up. You finally have composed yourself. You've thought, what should Biden have in his speech, sir?
I just got scooped. I was going to say the same thing as Nick said. I don't know. If I feel like we're investing an awful lot in Joe Biden in this.
He's an old man.
We're talking about, Biden beat Trump, but I'm not so sure that had a huge amount to do with Biden, right?
I think
Kamala behind him on the stage. That's what we're all going to look at. Right?
All right. You know what we're going to have to do, everybody? We're going to have to go for no other reason than my laptop is about to run out of power.
All right.
I'd like to thank you all for coming on to Mid-Atlantic this week. This has been obviously one of the weeks which is going to go down in not only American history and world history of what we've actually seen, unprecedented scenes. I don't want to say anything too trite, but hopefully this is going to be a moment where America pulls itself back from the brink. It realizes that rhetoric does matter in terms of the divisive and ugly rhetoric which we've had from Trump for the last 4 years, and that actually for it to be able to govern and to move forward, it needs to match up to its founding ideals and to include all Americans, and to realize that not all Americans start from the same point in life, but ultimately they need to all end up in the same place, and to have the hope and the wish and the aspiration of that vaunted American dream. Thank you for coming on to Mid-Atlantic this week, everybody. You've been an awesome panel. We'll see you all again soon, or at least you'll hear us all again soon, dear listener, in approximately 14 days' time. Yes, when we'll be looking at new President Biden, and we'll be analysing his inauguration speech. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.